All right, I think we can get started. Oh, all right, so let's just get started. So today we're going to be talking about becoming an effective engineering manager, brought to you by the Hack4Impact DX committee with some friends from the different chapters. So yeah, let's just start with some introductions. So I'm Sho. I'm currently a DX, which is a developer experience engineer for Hack4Impact, and I was formerly a engineering manager for Georgia Tech.
And hi, everyone. My name's Eric Newcomer. I'm the current National Co-Director of Engineering for Hack4Impact, and I also serve as the Cal Poly Co-Executive Director. And previously, I've done some engineering management work with different Hack4Impact teams. Yeah.
I'm Bryant. I'm the Cornell Engineering Chair. In the past, I was both a tech lead, which is the engineering manager position name at Cornell, and a project manager. I'm also on the H4I National Operations team and the Bytes Good team.
Hey everyone, my name is Vance. I'm a Hack4Impact DX engineer, and I'm also a software developer at Cal Poly.
Hey y'all, I'm Ethan, he, him pronouns. I'm the director of engineer at Cal Poly, and this summer I'll be on the developer education team at Slack.
And I'm Max. I'm the current executive director for Georgia Tech, Bits of Good, and also the former director of engineering.
All right, so today we'll be talking about becoming an effective engineering manager within Hack4Impact, as well as, kind of talking about some engineering leadership principles more broadly. So here's kind of an overview of our presentation. We'll first be going over some misconceptions, and then we'll talk about, how to motivate team members, and then properly organizing the development, a bit on developer education, and then finally talking about how you can set your developers up for success. And then if we have time, some Q&A. So now to Max with some misconceptions.
Yeah, thank you, Sho. Sho, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me all right? Just double checking again.
Thumbs
Perfect.
up.
Yeah. So, like I said, although I'm currently the executive director, I used to be the director of engineering for Bits of Good, or for Georgia Tech. What that means is that I guess in the time that I held that position, I spent a heck of a lot of my time working with, training, recruiting, just generally assisting and working with engineering managers at the Georgia Tech chapter. In particular, in recruiting and training in that initial process, I saw this misconception about people that were thinking about the engineering manager role time and time again. And that misconception, next slide, please, was that developer does not equal engineering manager. Or I guess the misconception was that the two were equivalent. What I'm telling you right now is that they're not. Now, on the one hand, it's easy to see that a developer is not an engineering manager. If you say it like that, obviously there's going to be some roles that an engineering manager has that a developer does not, particularly those pertaining to leadership. Yet, if you invert that sentence and you say an engineering manager is not a developer, that part often confuses people, because it actually happens that the two are not purely equal, and that there are some roles that an engineering manager does not necessarily have to have that a developer does. Next slide, please. The real misconception around the lack of equality between the two roles is that you do not have to be the best developer. This is typically the statement I get from people who are shy about it, don't know whether or not they want to be an engineering manager, don't know whether or not they're, quote, cut out for the position. You don't have to be the best developer because developers are not engineering managers. In practice, students usually aren't the best developer, even though they're the engineering manager, right? The development lead for the team. So the reason for this is take any project, that takes longer than just a hackathon to build, like longer than like 12 hours in like one framework, right? So that's going to be basically any Hack4Impact project ever. These projects have, I don't know, anywhere from like 3 to 5 different frameworks, dozens of different libraries. Now, granted, you should be familiar with the entire tech stack. You should be definitely confident with it, but it's not as if you have to be this God level developer that's super familiar with every single layer of the tech stack, right? You don't. Instead, next slide, please. You just have to be responsible for your project. What does this mean? Well, two things. One, when a developer comes to you with a problem, you don't have to have the answer off the top of your head like an absolute god where you literally are Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow exists for a reason, right? You just have to help them overcome that problem and solve it in time. Again, you need to be confident with every single layer of the tech stack, but god damn it, it's not as if you have to be Stack Overflow. And second, at the end of the semester, it falls on you ultimately to get your project across the finish line, right? So all of your developers are going to have some tasks they need to close up. It's up to you, and you're ultimately responsible for delivering the implementation, the technical implementation of your project. So that, just in my time at Georgia Tech, has been a misconception I've seen time and time again for people who are not sure if they want to be an engineering manager. They're a developer, they're trying to figure it out. And I'm here to tell you, you can be an engineering manager and you don't have to be the absolute and utter best developer out there ever. There's a whole nother set of responsibilities that all these wonderful people are going to talk about in just a second. So actually now, with that in mind, I'm going to transition it off to Eric to talk about motivating team members.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. And I guess before we get into this topic of motivating team members, let's start by considering a scenario. So one of your developers hasn't been attending your meetings and has been slacking on developer tasks. They say they are always too busy and have lots of work. What should you do in this scenario? Should you A, have a serious conversation with them, B, give them less work to do, C, have them work with someone else, or D, guide them through tasks? So I guess this is sort of interactive, so you can probably just say A, B, C, or D in the chat. I'll give you a second to do that. Seeing some responses here. A. Yeah. Okay. We're gonna move on. So the answer is none of the options. It was a trick question. The reason is because if the developer has reached this point of missing meetings and falling behind on tasks, there's most likely a gap in leadership. So if the team is run correctly, you should never reach a point like this. As a team lead, you should be proactive in dealing with these situations and not reactive. And a good analogy is healthcare. There are great treatments to serious health conditions, but preventing them from ever occurring is always better. And so today, that's mostly what our presentation is about. We will help you become preventative developer care experts. And now on to Sho to talk more about hacking motivation.
Thank you, Eric. Now let's talk about motivation. So this is rarely discussed, but I really think it should be about more, especially practically. Increasing motivation can be analogous to providing a better developer experience. Asking questions like, why are they part of Hack4Impact? Or what do they hope to accomplish can provide valuable insight on what to change for meetings, sprints, and task assignments as well. And with that, next slide, please. But the thing is, motivation is very fickle. Different things drive different people because everyone's really unique. Taking this all into consideration is very important though, because at the end of the day, these developers are volunteering their free time. As an EM, you can learn more about developers, like having one-on-one chats with them, messaging them individually over Slack, or even from the application responses with consent, because sometimes these questions are already built in. In this presentation, though, we'll stay general and discuss the few key reasons that we have found. They include wanting to help nonprofits, wanting more coding experience, wanting more friends. Let's take a look at each of these to see how you can give the developers what they want, because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. If you can build the team environment well enough, the devs will be successful, they'll enjoy Hack4Impact even more, and you won't have to do any micromanaging. So let's run through this list. Next slide, please. The first one, we want to help nonprofits. This one applies to most people that join Hack4Impact and is probably the easiest to incorporate. But very often though, the nonprofit is abstracted from developers, right? The PMs, the EMs, they end up being the only ones who meet with the nonprofit, and the developers only experience them through the tasks. And a lot of times they have no visibility at all. The easiest way to resolve this is just give them more visibility on the nonprofits. allow them to experience the nonprofit that they are helping. You could have the nonprofit come give a presentation to the team, allow them to demo big features during the nonprofit syncs, or even invite developers to the sprint planning meetings. All these can provide developers with more insight on the nonprofit. And by doing so, they'll understand the product goals and also the end user experience better as well. Take a look at some of these images here at the bottom. They're all from a nonprofit that I worked with as an EM last year called Hope Sustains Life. They focus on helping refugees in Haiti, Tanzania, and Bangladesh by providing supplies and building schools. But just looking at these images alone, they give you a better context on who you're trying to help and what you're trying to accomplish by building the product for them. Next slide. So the second one is we want more coding experience, right? This also is one that very commonly applies to lots of developers who apply for Impact, right? This doesn't mean though give them heavy tasks. It means allow them to grow so that they can be developer wizards as well. You can figure out not only what the developer's strengths are, but also the areas that they want to improve. Having variation in the tasks is great for helping developers build the skills and also to keep things interesting. Something else to also consider is that you should always be providing opportunities for learning. Teaching shouldn't be exclusively for bootcamp, right? You can give proper feedback on their MRs and PRs, share interesting developer articles and podcasts in your team Slack channel, right? There's many different ways you can incorporate learning as part of the developer experience. And it's not just, about bootcamp, right? But we'll talk more about bootcamp and learning later on. Next slide, please. We want cool friends. Honestly, I've met some really, really great people through Hack4Impact that I otherwise legit just wouldn't have met. And I think definitely that, and lots of people think as well, that this is a big reason why people join Hack4Impact. But in order to build these friendships, the developers need to be able to get to know each other and also to share experiences. As the engineering manager, if you provide opportunities for both, people have a great time on the team, right? Because instead of just, working with random students, it's working with your friends. And something that we experience, at Georgia Tech is people would literally just hang out, all the time in the Discord, right? And it didn't even have to be, Hack4Impact related, which I loved, so you can do things like having the developers work together. You can use icebreakers in breakout rooms, host different events, right? And coordinate lots of things just outside of the development, right? Because all of that matters as well. And it'll just make, development that much more enjoyable. And, they'll be that much more willing to do things like review each other's MRs and help each other out and things like that. Next slide. So lastly, it's really important to make it interesting, right? It's not like gymnasts where you have to stick the landing. You really just get points for trying, right? If you just try and put an effort to make it interesting, the developers will appreciate the effort you put in, right? Do things like Photoshop the team, have memes, right? Have icebreakers, make the meetings interesting. They have the rest of their lives for formal meetings. It's okay to have, silly meetings, albeit, still organized, but having interesting meetings is, great. It's fun. And here's an example. This is something that one of the designers did on our team, and they just drew everyone on our team, which is just, it's awesome. It's so cool, right? And if you make things interesting and just make it or just try, right, to make it less bland and try to make it more surprising, it'll definitely be a better experience overall. And this is obviously something that you can work with the PM on, but definitely recommend it. Just don't be scared to try new things. And now to Bryant with organizing development, which is our next section. So yeah, that's just it for organizing or for hacking motivation and encouraging motivation. And yeah, now to Bryant.
Thanks, Sho. So now let's talk about organizing development, right? These are things that you should keep in mind when undertaking your project. So one of the most important things is to communicate with your PM, right? Since engineering chair or engineering manager and PM, they must co-lead the project together, right? It's necessary for them to be always on the same page about all team related activities. So along with meeting with the whole team, right, you should have one-on-one check-ins with your PM to discuss the team's progress and make a plan for how to proceed forward, right? Back when I ran projects, I would do this basically at least once a week. Next slide. Yeah, so another important thing is to know the scope of your project, right? If you're trying to make a social media app completely from scratch in one semester, you're gonna run into a lot of problems really quickly. Part of it is just learning how long things will take, right? If task estimation maybe is not your strong suit, run it by other EMs, right? Other people who have more experience may have more insight and can help you out. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the team doesn't have to code everything from scratch, right? It's perfectly fine to use a starter template for your code base. In fact, we strongly encourage you to do so. For example, UIUC and UPenn, they have great templates in the MERN template and the Flask-based template, respectively. The team will not lose out on opportunities if they can't code a login page, for the nth time. Your solutions are expected to involve a lot of technical challenges, so look for things that can give you a leg up. It's okay to incorporate things like a CMS such as Netlify. Look for libraries that can use like React Stripe, right? Unless the project is really, really small, it's doubtful that you'll run out of tasks for developers to code, right? There are always improvements you can make. Which kind of leads me to our next step, which is, you always have to plan ahead. Remember, we want to be preemptive, not reactionary. So the best way to deal with these problems is to plan for them. So one important thing is you always want to build buffer time into your project plan at the start of the semester. Roadblocks, setbacks, they do occur. It's a natural part of the development process. So don't be too frazzled when something doesn't go according to plan. It will happen, but work with your PM, work with your team to overcome them. The buffer time should give you enough flexibility to kind of account for this. Another important thing to keep in mind is that if you're uncertain about a project and your ability to accomplish a task, a good rule of thumb is to underpromise and overdeliver. Another thing is to always account for the ebb and flow of the semester. Right? Developers will have more time depending on where they are in the semester. Midterms, projects, people become busier and less busy naturally, and so account for this when assigning deliverables. Another super important thing is, your partner organization. Keep them in mind. You want to keep communication between your team and your partner organization consistent and flowing. This is pretty important, especially if designers are blocked. Eventually, from lack of communication, eventually that might trickle down and block development. Also, feature creep can occur, especially without a well-defined plan, right? Get your plan of what features to include down in writing before development starts, and make sure your partner organization agrees with it before development starts. This will reduce the probability of feature creep. Get it in writing in such as like a PRD document. Another thing we want to talk about is, how do we, increase the probability of success of a project? One thing that's important to know is understand each developer's strengths and weaknesses, right? Just because you can do a task quickly, it doesn't mean that other developers can, right? Account for this when planning. Developers will have different levels of knowledge and experiences. So remember when you're doing this, remember this when you're assigning weekly deliverables. Another thing to keep in mind is, pair programming. Pair programming is a great way to overcome any knowledge or experience deficiencies. It creates accountability, as now there's an understanding that both developers should do something in order to kind of create this deliverable and deliver it on time, right? It also helps less experienced devs gain experience. And again, as we said earlier, developer motivation is huge, right? And this is inextricably tied to the probability of success. There's a piece of advice I actually received from a professor once. It said the foundations of a culture of a group happen from the moment you establish that group, right? And once that's established, it's fairly hard to change. So if devs don't care, things aren't getting done, they won't get done. So establish that they should care at the beginning. and really create a great root for the culture of your team. And so now I'll pass off to Eric to talk more about organizing development.
Yep. Thank you, Bryant. And so I guess to move on with some last things that I want to say about organizing development, we recommend that you move quickly. So like Bryant mentioned, avoiding project creep is difficult, and with hard deadlines at the end of the semester, it will put a lot of pressure on you. But don't stress too much if this happens, though. Multiple projects have had to finish off the development work towards the end, but with enough organization, this kind of crunch time development can be minimized. So in order to move quickly, you should have weekly sprint tasks. We have found this to be the most ideal. For one, many times people will put off their task until the day before it's due anyway. Another reason is because having smaller tasks every week is better than bigger ones every 2 weeks, and more work will definitely get done. So you can definitely meet more frequently than once a week, perhaps just to check in, but then you might end up, I don't know, burning out some of your members. So it's always just a matter of balance. Also, you don't want to waste time at the beginning. Often teams have to wait for designers to finish mock-ups in order to start development, but that shouldn't prevent you from beginning some of the basic development tasks that all projects kind of have, like have with backend functionality, for example. So we also recommend having a set code review process. So you're going to want to have due dates for each sprint. A good recommendation is that the PRs are due 24 hours before the next sprint meeting. This allows 1 day for code review, and in the case that there are any gaps in the work, the developers have some time to fix it without having to worry about the next sprint task. Also, you want to clearly define acceptance or doneness criteria. For each task you assign, there should be at least 2 criteria that should outline the state and capabilities of the code when the task is fully completed. So this can also be displaced by the task description, but it does wonders for accountability so that things don't slip through the cracks. So, just putting that, in your little card as the description on whatever Kanban board that you sort of use will really help developers know what they have to do to finish a task. So you also want to determine who gets to review pull requests. It's perfectly fine if it's always you, but if it is a lot of work, and if it is a lot of work for you and your team does have senior devs, they can also help you with those code reviews. And then lastly, we also highly recommend using GitHub project boards with automated actions to keep track of tasks. So then next, it's important to note that in order to keep the team organized, you also have to keep yourself organized. You need to set the example for the rest of the team, and using a GitHub board or any kind of Kanban board like Trello or the ones on Notion is a good way to track tasks. Creating everything as an issue in the board on GitHub specifically allows you to track them easily. And the easier the board is to access, the greater chance that people will actually use it. That's been huge. So when you run a meeting, make sure that you are kind of referring back to this Kanban board that you use, but also it's also important that you run meetings with an agenda so you know what you're talking about every time. And finally, you want to make sure that your team follows best practices with a particular emphasis on testing. So CI/CD with a service like Travis CI or Circle CI or GitHub Actions. Linting, which I'll take a second to plug the official Hack4Impact linter extension for VS Code or JetBrains. One of our contributors on the DX committee made that, so definitely go check that out if you haven't already. Pull request templates, these can be made on GitHub, and then pull request reviews, documentation, the principle of try, don't repeat yourself, and strong typing when and where you can. So TypeScript or React prop types are very important. Yeah, and so that kind of concludes the section on organizing development. Now we're going to move on to talking about developer education with Ethan.
Yeah. So thank you, Eric. I'll be covering developer education, but more so incoming developers and bootcamp. Next slide. So for most incoming members, web development's a new concept. It's not usually taught in classes. And this past year at Cal Poly, this was kind of a huge challenge for us because most of our members were new, incoming members. Most haven't done web development before, so kind of had to catch them up to speed. And Hack4Impact specifically, This is an important issue because our apps are web apps, so we gotta get people up to speed quickly. Luckily, we have a bootcamp to kind of tackle this problem. The focus of this bootcamp is more on preparing devs for actual project work. Now, what does this really mean? It's impossible to teach all parts of web development. Like, there's just way too much. You can't fit that into a 10-week bootcamp or 5 weeks. Like, that's ridiculous. So it's way better to focus your limited time on the actual developer and their soft skills. So this is things like working to find solutions on their own, fitting things together, and just squashing bugs. And that's mainly because that's what most of web dev is. You're not just sitting there writing HTML all day. Like if it was, the bootcamp probably be a week long, pretty easy. So what is the most effective way to get people like ready for an actual project? Next slide. Learn by doing, the Cal Poly motto. So theory and lectures can only go so far. Like I could sit here and talk about working with a database or user authentication all day, and you might get a conceptual understanding of it. But then if I told you like, okay, now go implement user auth, maybe some of you could, but I doubt it. There's still a lot of implementation details that you'd have to figure out. So instead, we want to focus on active engagement with some self-reflection throughout bootcamp. The active engagement really just means like getting your hands dirty with code. And that's super useful for building a personal mental model of what's going on with the software. And this mental model helps clarify the enigma that is software. Because, it's kind of invisible. Like what's really going on? No idea. So having this mental model helps people discover solutions that don't already exist. The self-reflection part kind of happens naturally throughout bootcamp as people are just going through trial and error of development. And that basically looks like internalizing when things work and when things don't work, and then taking that and applying it to future problems. So how can we take this concept and apply it to a bootcamp? Well, knowing our incoming developers are mostly unfamiliar with web development, we kind of break our bootcamp into two parts, a workshop section and project. The workshops are concept-oriented, and they're kind of used just to introduce new concepts at a pretty high level. So like declarative functions, async await stuff, React hooks, just kind of all those web dev stuffs. And in the spirit of learn by doing, quick follow-along exercises could kind of be peppered in those workshops just to keep people engaged with the material and start building that mental model as it's being introduced. We'd also explain kind of how these new concepts can build off of previous concepts. So with React hooks, how they can be used to call APIs. And then we would close off these workshops with a mini live coded demo, hopefully fun, just to kind of show like a way to apply it to something real and then what working with it looks like. The project is a more personal endeavor, and that's kind of built over the entire course of the bootcamp. And this is really where the hands-on learning comes into play. We try to time it so it's closely tied in with the concepts we're covering in workshop, just on a looser timeline because people get busy. Like everyone's still a student, so don't want to add too much work on. But it is built up over time, piece by piece. And we kind of started with like HTML, CSS, and then added some client-side JavaScript, and then some Node APIs, database stuff with Mongo, and then a React front end. So kind of working through that whole flow with the workshops really lets people integrate their learnings into a project. And this structure is really based around the mastery model of learning, where you really only move on after you understand whatever you're supposed to understand. And in our case, that's more about the ability to implement. To exercise more of the problem-solving side of development, we've really encouraged people to experiment while implementing whatever feature of the project. And this was done by providing a pretty loose structure or a loose set of project requirements and encouraging to find their own solutions, or at least ways of going about solving them. Some solutions are definitely better than others, but letting people, find out for themselves is really good for just figuring it out for themselves. And this really does turn learning into a personal responsibility. So as an engineering manager, this is not an excuse to get lazy with bootcamp. You should definitely be providing ample resources and help because it's your job to ensure everyone can succeed throughout this bootcamp. And this success really comes when you allow devs to explore things for themselves, encourage them to ask for help, and then work with them when they come to you for help, working with them to find a solution. You definitely don't need to hold their hand because you're working with devs at a great school. You need to trust them and their ability and willingness to learn. So ideally, after you complete the bootcamp, everyone is going to have some level of understanding. And at Cal Poly, we found that new members were really quickly able to contribute to the project team as a result of this mastery-based approach. From like week one, people were already contributing to projects, which really helps get that dev cycle going quickly. Additionally, because people just made a full stack project on their own, they'll be able to reference that throughout the project cycle, which I've heard from a tech lead, like people do that. So that's kind of cool, nice helpful tool there. And then most importantly, new members are going to gain some confidence to finding solutions on their own for problems they come up against, which I think overall that's kind of our goal when running a bootcamp. So with that, I'll transition over to Vance for setting developers up for success.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. So this last section, we're going to be talking about setting developers up for success and how to improve communication within your team. So to start off, we just recommend giving developers lots of options. Figure out what they're interested in doing and what they want to learn so they can work on tasks that are meaningful to them. One great way that you can find out what developers are interested in is by sending out a survey at the beginning of your project and asking what their strengths and weaknesses, coding preferences, and learning areas are. And this is also just a great opportunity to get to know your team members more as individuals. And then once you know more about them, you can kind of tailor tasks that meet their needs and demands. And in addition, every week you can kind of give developers options as far as which tasks they want to pick. So for example, if you look at this image in the bottom right, you could create a Google slide and just allow individuals to drag their profile pictures up into the little tasks. And that just gives them a fun way to kind of pick which task they're working on each week. So that way they're both contributing to the project and they're working on something that they want to work on. The next thing we're going to be talking about is how to write project tasks well, so you're clearly communicating what they're actually going to be working on. So there's two key principles here. The first one is that you don't want to build tasks based off of presumptions. So you want to have very clear acceptance and doneness criteria, so that way they know what's in and out of scope. If your scope isn't clearly defined, developers could get confused and they might not end up finishing a project, or they might end up taking on too much work and doing things that don't really need to be done. Additionally, your tasks shouldn't have any dependencies. So they shouldn't be waiting on some other task to be finished this week. They should be able to start right after that task is assigned, so they are able to fit the task better into their own personal schedule. Additionally, it's a good idea to provide resources within your task descriptions. And also make sure to include suggestions if you think that you might be able to help out the development of a task. So some useful things you could provide within your task descriptions are things such as online guided videos, NPM packages, and UI mockups. So just as an example, if you're about to implement a calendar feature within your app, and you know of a really good calendar NPM that the devs might not know about, you can just mention it within the task description, so they can get to working quicker and they don't have to put in the research to figure out what calendar and PM to use. You can just kind of give that to them and give them a head start. And then the last principle that we want to talk about is just listen to developers and adapt. Every developer is going to be a bit different. So just make sure that you're leaving all your channels of communication open. So that way they can always keep in touch with you if something goes awry. And also just good for accountability within your team. So there's lots of ways to do this. One way you could do this is just at the beginning of your team meeting, have a retrospective, just similar to like a Agile Scrum stand-up meeting. Have everyone say what they're working on, how it went, and if they ran into any issues. This just makes it a lot easier to understand where each of your developers are at the end of every week and kind of keep tabs on them and just allow the team to communicate more. Additionally, after task assignments, you can implore devs to ask questions about new tasks. So if they have concerns right after a task is assigned, they can immediately share that with you instead of waiting to kind of ask that after the fact. You should also just stay after meetings if they have questions then, just so you can catch any last minute questions. And then finally, one great way to communicate with your devs is just set up one-on-one meetings just once or twice during a quarter or semester. And this allows you to just establish a personal connection with each of your devs and make sure that you're both comfortable talking with one another. So with all that in mind, I believe we've now reached the Q&A section of our presentation. So if you have any questions at all, just feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, real quick before we start, I just wanted to address, so Jeffrey, are you talking about this bottom one then?
No, I think the one right before, go
Okay.
go back. Yeah, this one. I think it's just, I think it's just like some Kanban board app, right? I think, but yeah, definitely would recommend either, Trello or also using the GitHub projects. Those have been, the ones that have been the easiest or most successful, at least for me.
Yeah, Sho, isn't this actually where you?
Oh, but this one, this one is shout out to the Hope Sustained Life gang. They're great. Yeah, we would like for every single sprint, they would get to choose what, tasks they worked on, right? And it didn't have to be the same thing. It could be, anything, but it just made it so, they could have more input on what they get to work on.
Yeah, so I guess with that being addressed, we have reached the Q&A section of this presentation. So like Vance mentioned, if you have any questions or even comments about the presentation, please drop them in the chat. I should get the chat open probably.
Yeah, I have a question. So I see a lot of engineering managers at Bits of Good having to teach their developers how to do a lot of the tasks they assign, or they end up doing a lot of the tasks themselves. And in moderation, I think it's fine, but a lot of times they seem really stressed about this. Are there any specific ways you guys have found to kind of circumnavigate this issue?
Yeah,
sure.
I can go ahead. Oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, you were mentioning that it makes the devs really stressed or the engineering managers really stressed, or just both?
Well, probably both, but I was more talking on the EM side because they end up having to do, a lot of the work themselves, along with managing all the devs.
Okay, I see. I think in terms of like teaching the actual developers, it seems like what should happen is that a lot of what is taught in bootcamp should help developers get to a certain level. But if that's not the case, and engineering managers do need to help developers, we did mention providing resources and tutorials on how to implement a given thing. But I guess I think along with that, if you do have the time to work in paired program with them, then you can handle that and help kind of coach them as they go. But I think Ben might have something to say because he raised his hand.
Indeed, I did. I feel like if you're running into that issue a lot, some of it can also be like the relationship between the PM and the EM also. like if the product manager is bringing up like a really hefty roadmap and the EM feels really pressured to get it done, I feel like that leads to a lot of the EMs just do the work themselves because they agreed to this thing and now they have to get it done and they don't feel like the team that they were matched up with is sort of ready for the challenge. So I feel like some of it is just like, if they're working with the devs, they see their experience level and they see there might be a problem here, they might need to go back to the PM and say, we have to cut down on what we're doing, or I don't know, push more on the front end side than the back end side for this semester, because that's just how the team shook out. Anything to just reduce the load so it doesn't feel like there's all this pressure to keep going.
Right, agreed.
And also, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, if I just add on to that real quick. Yeah, I do think that part of it is kind of planning ahead and saying like, hey, where are our developers at right now, and kind of accounting for that when assigning tasks and when planning out for the semester. It's super important to kind of understand where your developers are at, so that you won't have to kind of code everything yourself, and leave time for them to learn, leave time for them to grow and kind of look things up. Because oftentimes, your developers, if a lot of times it'll take longer than you might initially anticipate, just because they'll need time to learn.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll just add something really quickly. So yeah, two things. So I guess the only two options are that you make the learning process less painful, or you gain more resources. On the gaining more resources side, right? Like there can be other people that help the developers if they're stuck besides the EM, right? And this can just be like additional floating resources that you have as an organization. For example, like Bits of Good at Georgia Tech, recently started doing more developer office hours, which has been super successful for a way to have developers get help outside of just the engineering manager. I know UIUC, I think, does something interesting where they actually get some of the alumni to help, right? Which I think it was kind of weird, but if it works for you all, it can, right? Like just create different channels and avenues where developers can get help from other people besides just the engineering manager, just to relieve some of that burden off of the engineering manager, just because they have so much other things to worry about, right? On the other side, where it's like making it easier, right? Like I think, as previously mentioned, make it into smaller chunks. Paired programming is a great way of addressing that as well. And typically, pair one person who has more experience with one person who has less experience, and that typically definitely works. And I think back to Ben, or unless that's still Ben.
Well, I think his hand's just permanently raised. He's doing this the entire time. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah,
I'm always ready to talk. If anyone stops talking, I will butt in, and I'm just reserving that seat. Go.
Ethan said in the chat that he's stretching. Ben, are you really flexible now? No. I think
doing Peloton work.
Ben's a full-time dev at Peloton, so that's a meme right there. I think, Jay, you asked a complex question, and I think with all the variety of answers that have been provided, I mean, it's obviously a complex situation that's a function of a number of different things on each project team: the availability of the devs, the skill level of the devs, as well as the motivation of the devs. Hopefully, I guess like one of the goals of this workshop is for each of those different dimensions, there's certain strategies that you can take to improve on those. And I think each of these sections did address in some fashion each of those dimensions to try to make it better. So I guess that's a wrap on that question. I do have an immediate answer to a question here from Michael Chet in the chat, which is, how can I facilitate 2 or more people productively working on the same task? How can we avoid the issue where one person is doing all of the work? And I imagine other people have ways to jump in here, but I think there's 2 immediate things that come to mind. Number one, having a sort of expectation that the developers set up a meeting between themselves, such that they can talk through the problem together, they can workshop it. And then when you have that, a second thing for sure, these are just kind of like quick and immediate strategies that I think could be useful. The second one is making sure that as we've seen before, as others talked about in the slides, knowing the respective skill levels of each of your developers and then pairing them accordingly, such that you match developers that are kind of adjacent, so to speak, in their respective skill level. So if you have one developer that's really like the best developer and then you have the worst, perhaps you don't pair them together that often, because doing so would mean that one does everything and one does nothing. Now, sometimes you're given a situation just with a project team where that's difficult because you have a lot of really good developers and a lot of not so great developers, and that becomes more difficult. But I guess those are two quick hitter strategies for taking advantage of that. Again, I imagine other people have other thoughts as well.
I mean, I agree on all that. And the only thing I would add is like, at least something that we do at Peloton, is like a sort of driver navigator forced approach, where like when you do pair programming, you can definitely end up in the state where one person is coding the whole time and the other person is advising the whole time. And that makes it very lopsided. So I don't know, forcing it, like doing a screen share and trading off every like 10, 15 minutes between the person that's actually editing. I know VS Code also has something for this that makes it kind of like Google Docs, but yeah, just sort of forcing a collaborative energy and having one person sort of explain the code and the other person typing and switch off.
Ben, if someone wanted to learn more about that strategy, would they happen to just Google mob programming to get a gist? Is this?
I think someone wrote about that. Yeah. Mob programming is interesting. That's if you have more than two people in the same call, but similar principle. I guess I could plug that article, but there's probably better ones.
But yeah, and also just to add on that, like, yeah, that definitely can become a problem. But you know, if you like if the developers have good relationships with each other, they'll definitely, you know, stay on top of it and try to like make sure that the work is balanced. But also as an EM, you should definitely try to check in on the developers, you know, either, you know, during the week, just ask how the task is going, or also as part of like the beginning of the next sprint task, you can have like a little bit of a retrospective, right? Like have the developers go around and talk about exactly like what they did, some of the issues that they ran into, and you know, be able to resolve it, right? It's not going to be the time to just be like, hey, I did all the work, like help me. But it can be about the time where like, you know, maybe then the developers who didn't do as much can have a little bit more of a reflection on, you know, why they didn't do it, or talk about, you know, if they were too busy, or different things like that, right? Just so you can stay ahead of and on top of, you know, things, you know, these paired programming tasks from becoming too lopsided. Okay, should we move on to the next question? All right, so the next question is, what are some things EMs can do during the semester to improve project sustainability after deployment? E.g. resolving any technical issues that come up 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, etc. later, right? So I think first and foremost, this is a problem that, you know, lots of projects experience, right? What happens after it gets shipped? And there's lots of varying opinions, right? Some people believe, okay, you know what, like we finished with the project this semester, we delivered it, like that is the end of our responsibilities, because, you know, we have so much other work that we have to do. And that's perfectly fine, right? Like they might have to find other new developers if they want to maintain and, you know, continue, I guess, working on new features outside of the scope of what you all did. But also, you know, there could be things like, oh, there's big bugs, like it literally doesn't work for XYZ reasons. And it essentially would mean that like all the work that we did would go to waste. So in which case you definitely need, as part of your organization, or you, if you'd like to, have a process where they can come back to the organization and request some changes, right? Like it could be like minor bug fixes. It could be, you know, oh, reach out to this new point of contact if you have any kind of issues with it. And then maybe perhaps you have some developers that, you know, work on fixes, improvements, and bugs. And also something good to keep in mind is you can also, you know, incorporate this into the bootcamp as well, right? A lot of the times, great ways for developers to learn is look at existing code and, you know, start with small things. And the small things are, you know, those bug fixes. You know, a lot of times in the industry, they will give you bug fixes or small little minute things to get you ramped up on bigger tasks later on. And that could just be one way of going about, sustainability as well.
While we're on the topic of sustainable projects, I want to go ahead and share my screen here for those folks watching. If you're not watching, somehow if you're listening, this isn't a podcast, but if you're listening in, I've opened up Sentry. So if you're talking about sustainability of project after the fact and resolving technical issues, as Sho said, there definitely needs to be sort of human infrastructure in place to handle those issues. But one of the best ways to catch them is to install some form of a library or a framework into your project, like Sentry. Sentry is probably one of the best ones out there, particularly because, as I'm showing here, it has some awesome tiers, free tiers for nonprofits. Hey, by the way, Hack4Impact is a registered 501c3, and also you can have your nonprofit partners sign up on your behalf and then connect your project together with their nonprofit status. So Sentry is a great tool in order to track and report bugs after the project timeline and able to resolve them as they come up. As Sho said, there's also small feature requests, other changes that aren't particularly captured by Sentry, but I certainly know that the Georgia Tech chapter has had a heck of a lot of success using this in a number of our projects, particularly those that have just more than one nonprofit. So yeah, Sentry is a great tool, and it has a great free tier for keeping track of bugs after that project handoff.
Awesome. So I guess to move on to the next question from Michael about setting kind of these loose deadlines where you kind of document how many hours they spent on a given task, and just looking at the code that they checked. I think it's definitely like okay to be flexible with deadlines, but with that being said, I think it's still important to have deadlines that developers can aim for and to kind of give them an incentive to get something done. But it's definitely okay to be flexible with those deadlines. It might get a little bit more important that they finish those things on time towards the end of the development of the project. But in the beginning, I think it's definitely okay to be flexible, and also just to see, gauge how long it'll take a developer to finish a given task. Yeah.
Yeah. Something I would note is like, I think it definitely gets hard when you have like variable deadlines. So I think maybe one way of going about it is like, if I guess you're unsure how long it'll take, or if it will take a long time, like try to break it down into like even smaller chunks for them to do, and that definitely helps make things a little bit more concrete, right? Because like if it's just one very small specific thing, it's a lot easier to gauge how much time or how long it would take. Additionally, really just check in with your developers, and I'd recommend like at the end of your sprint meeting, when you like assign the tasks, like ask the developers if there's any kind of like concerns or considerations that they have. And this could just be like, hey, does anyone have anything coming up this week? Is there anything that we need to be like aware of? And you can, even if you still want to be flexible, you can just go out and straight out ask the developers, when do you think that it'll be done, right? And always make sure to do this in advance. If you are going to do it, be like, when do you think you can finish this specific task by, right? And have them kind of tell you when they can, what they can commit to specifically, and then hold them accountable to it. Because I think, yeah, there definitely can be some flexibility, but it definitely makes things, a little more complex. But yeah.
Awesome. So I think we are approaching 4 p.m. Pacific time, I guess 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I do want to respect everyone's schedule and time. So thank you all for coming to the presentation today. And if you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to any of us on Slack. I think I tagged all of us in the general channel, but we'll all be really happy to help you out if you have any questions in the future. But yeah, with that, thank you all for coming today. And we're excited to see all the amazing engineering managers that you become one day.
Thank you, everybody. Have an awesome night.